Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of thing you were never supposed to hear. It begins in the year 1863, while America was drenched in civil war, while brothers carved each other open on the battlefield, while the nation split itself in two. And in the shadows of that chaos, a family in Virginia held a wedding. Not a wedding of joy, not a wedding of love, but a wedding where bloodlines, wealth, and control were bound together in something far more sinister. The Carvers. A name whispered in small-town histories, scrubbed from newspapers, silenced in sermons. Their wealth came not just from land and cotton, but from something older. Ritual, belief, power dressed up as tradition. The story begins on a wedding night, where the bride did not walk willingly to her chamber. She was escorted, ushered. Because the Carvers had a rule, the groom was not the first to touch his wife. That honor, if you can call it that, belonged to the patriarch of the family. The father, the elder, the man who sealed the marriage before his son ever laid hands upon her. A twisted rite disguised as heritage, justified as ancient duty, concealed under layers of scripture and secrecy. It was the price of belonging to the Carver name, and it happened not once, not twice, but through generations. Now imagine for a moment what that does to a bloodline, what it does to the psyche of men born into such a house, knowing their brides would not belong to them on their wedding night. What it does to the women who carried those scars into silence, forbidden from speaking against the very men who ruled their lives. This wasn't love. This wasn't faith. This was ownership. A perverse assertion of power written into flesh. But here is the real question you must ask yourself. Why does history erase stories like this? Why do textbooks polish the past into neat battles and noble names? Why do traditions like the Carvers vanish into rumor? It is because truth corrodes obedience. Truth dissolves the illusions we're meant to kneel before. And if men discovered just how much of their lives are shaped by unspoken rituals of power, they might stop playing the game altogether. The Carver wedding night was not merely about lust or dominance. That's too shallow a reading, the kind that blinds weaker men to the machinery of power. No, this was a ritual of transfer, a covenant. In 1863, while common men bled and starved for causes they didn't understand, the Carvers were performing their own war in silence, the war to preserve their bloodline's control. Every bride became a vessel, not for love, not for partnership, but for continuation of a private empire. Think about the psychology at work here. Imagine being the son. You stand at the altar, dressed in black wool, reciting vows you don't control, to a woman you'll never truly claim. The ceremony is public, the feast loud, the dancing glorious. But everyone in that room knows what will come later. Your father will enter her before you. He will initiate her. He will show her who rules this family, and he will remind you of your place, beneath him, forever. And you, shaking, humiliated, but bound by the unspoken rule, will accept it. Because to resist is to forfeit everything. This was control on a level most men cannot fathom. It wasn't just about ruling women, it was about ruling men. The Carver sons were broken before they could ever rise. They were trained into obedience, forced to internalize shame as loyalty. And so the cycle repeated. One generation after another, women were sacrificed, and men were hollowed out, all to sustain a tradition that appeared invisible to the outside world. But do not mistake invisibility for weakness. The most effective systems of control are the ones that never make it to public memory. What's hidden is always more dangerous than what's obvious. And here's the truth no historian wants to whisper. The Carvers were not alone. Their rite was simply one of the few that survived in rumor. Across the South, across the old colonies, there were families who bound them, elves by rituals the outside world never saw. Some used violence, some used sex, some used secrecy, but all of them use power as their scripture. Now ask yourself, what other traditions have been erased? How many histories of your own country have been scrubbed clean because the truth would burn through the myths you were raised to worship? How much of your loyalty to nation, to church, to family is built on shadows you've never been allowed to see? The night of initiation wasn't just a private ritual. It was theater. The Carvers made sure the house echoed with it. Servants were told to remain nearby, to hear the sounds, to know that the patriarch still held dominion. Whispers of screams were as important as the act itself, because silence breeds questions, but noise breeds certainty. Everyone who lived under that roof, everyone who worked the land, everyone who took wages from the Carver purse, they all knew what had been done. And because they knew, they bowed deeper. That's the part history never tells you. That control isn't about laws written in books, but about laws written in flesh. Fear carved into the psyche lasts longer than ink on paper. Once a tradition like this is normalized, once it infects the bloodline, there is no need for chains. The chains live inside the mind. And what man dares rebel when rebellion means losing not just inheritance, but identity? Here is what you must understand. The Carvers called it the right of the first. A name polished to sound ancient, respectable, almost biblical. They cloaked their depravity in the language of sacred duty. That's how corruption always survives, by pretending it is holy. By convincing men that what they are doing is not grotesque but necessary. And in 1863, when war made the world unstable, the Carvers clung to this right as if it were their anchor, their shield against change. Do you see the pattern yet? Nations wage wars, but families wage rituals. Governments fall, but houses like the Carvers endure, because they operate below the surface, in shadows that no revolution can touch. That is why history erases them, not because they were unimportant, but because they reveal a truth more devastating than any battlefield casualty. That power is maintained not just by armies or votes, but by secrets. And now we step closer to the abyss. Because if one family, in Virginia, carried out such a tradition, how many others did? How many names you revere today were built on rituals you will never read about in books? Do you think corruption is born in Washington? Or does it crawl from dining rooms, from bedrooms, from family chambers where obedience is carved into the flesh of the next generation? By the time the sun rose after a Carver wedding, the bride was changed forever, but so was the groom. Imagine waking to your new wife, her eyes hollow, her silence thicker than the air in that chamber. You know what has been done, and you know you permitted it. Worse, you know that someday, you will be the one doing it to your own son's bride. The cycle closes like iron jaws, and there is no way out without shattering everything. This is how corruption becomes eternal. Not because people enjoy it, not even because they believe in it, but because they are trapped by it. Power has a way of binding men into chains they mistake for destiny. The Carvers were masters at this. They told their sons, "This is the way of men. This is the way of strength. If you resist, you shame us all. If you comply, you become part of something bigger than yourself." And so the sons complied, passing on the same wound, generation after generation. But here's the deeper truth. The Carver tradition was not just about women. It was about men learning that their power was always borrowed, that no matter how high they rose, there would always be someone above them. It was hierarchy written into their bloodline. The father breaks the son, so the son will never dream of freedom. The son breaks his own son, and the cycle deepens. This is not family. This is feudalism disguised as kinship. And you wonder why America is filled with men who smile at church but drink themselves numb at night. Why lines of inheritance are poisoned with resentment and silence. These are not isolated tragedies. They are echoes. Rituals like the Carvers didn't just vanish. They dissolved into culture, into the way fathers and sons relate, into the way women are silenced, into the way obedience is disguised as love. But let me ask you something darker. Do you believe this was only the Carvers' invention? Or do you think they borrowed it from somewhere older, deeper, more ancient than America itself? Because the truth is, this right of the first has appeared in whispers across civilizations. Medieval lords claimed the same right over their vassals' brides. Ancient kings performed rituals of first claim to prove their supremacy over households. It is not an American sickness. It is a human one. The Carvers may have wrapped it in Southern tradition, but they were repeating a pattern older than any constitution. Power always seeks to penetrate the most sacred bonds, to prove itself by violating what should be untouchable. That's why the wedding night was chosen. It wasn't random, it was symbolic. The wedding is supposed to represent new beginnings, private vows, the birth of trust. By shattering that trust at its very root, the Carvers ensured that love could never exist without their shadow hovering over it. Do you see the brilliance in its cruelty? The act wasn't just about dominance in the moment. It was about infecting the future. Every child born in that house would be marked with doubt. Was he truly the son of the groom? Or of the patriarch? Bloodlines blurred. Authority blurred. And that blur made the Carvers untouchable, because no son could ever fully claim his own life. Every child carried the father's shadow. This is how corruption protects itself. Not through brute force, not through public laws, but through quiet acts that nobody dares speak of. And because nobody speaks, the tradition continues. Silence is the soil in which power grows best. And here's what chills me. This was 1863. 160 years ago. Yet even today, families still guard rituals you are not meant to know. They may not look like the Carvers' right, but they serve the same purpose. Control the rento. Secrecy. You are surrounded by them. Political dynasties, banking clans, even the way your own institutions initiate their members. Always silence. Always obedience. Always power hidden behind ceremony. The Carver ritual, if you look closely, wasn't simply about family. It was a blueprint for how power sustains itself across centuries. The act itself was horrifying, yes. But the psychology behind it is where the true darkness hides. Power doesn't just want to be exercised. It wants to be remembered. It wants to carve itself into the minds of those beneath it so deeply that they never imagine escape. And so, on every Carver wedding night, what was really happening was the transfer of memory. A living scar passed down, ensuring that no matter how many sons were born, none would ever forget who ruled them. Think about it. If the groom had consummated the marriage first, the memory would be joy, union, love. That memory could empower him, give him a sense of independence, a bond beyond his father's reach. But by stealing that moment, the patriarch ensured that the son's very first step into manhood was marked by humiliation, shame, and obedience. The memory itself became a leash. And a leash inside the mind is stronger than any chain on the wrist. This is how corruption lasts when governments fall and armies crumble. It doesn't need soldiers. It needs silence. It doesn't need weapons. It needs rituals. The Carvers knew that. And so they crafted a system where every man was broken before he ever had the chance to rise. Where every woman was silenced before she could ever find her voice. And here is the most chilling part. Nobody outside the family ever stopped it. Neighbors knew. Servants knew. Local pastors whispered. But who dares intervene in a tradition that hides behind wealth and religion? Who dares accuse a family that feeds the community, owns the land, and controls the pulpit? That is the secret armor of power. Complicity. When enough people know but remain silent, corruption becomes invisible. It becomes normal. You must never forget this. The Carvers are not just a grotesque story from the past. They are an example of how easily entire communities can bow to what they know is wrong, simply because speaking would cost them everything. And if you think this kind of silence only lived in the 1800s, look again at your own time. Look again at the secrets you sense but cannot name. Look again at the rituals hidden in plain sight around you. The Carvers are gone, but their shadow still rules. Picture the house where it happened. A sprawling Virginia estate. Oak trees heavy with moss. Shutters cracked just enough for the neighbors to wonder, but never to see. In the parlor, Portraits of ancestors lined the walls. Carver men in rigid poses, their eyes painted like watchmen, staring down every guest who dared to enter. That house was not a home. It was a stage. Every hallway, every room carried whispers of what was expected, what would be repeated, what could never be spoken. On the night of a wedding, servants would prepare the chamber. Fresh sheets, candles burning low, wine poured thick and red. But the bride was not led there by her husband. She was led by him, the patriarch. A man twice her age, his hands heavy with the weight of land deeds and family scripture. She knew what was coming. Everyone did. And yet no one stopped it. The walls absorbed her silence, the estate swallowed her tears, and by dawn the ritual was complete. The Carvers called it honor. The world outside never even knew it happened. Why am I telling you this? Because I want you to see what power looks like when it is stripped of illusion. This is not democracy. This is not liberty. This is what hides beneath the words printed in textbooks and speeches. Power, in its purest form, is the ability to violate the sacred and face no consequence. That is what the Carvers held. That is what many families still hold, though their rituals may be disguised in cleaner clothing now. The danger for you is simple. If you don't recognize how these systems work, you will walk right into their jaws without ever realizing it. Because they no longer need to drag you into chambers. They don't need oak estates or candlelit rooms. Today they do it with contracts, with screens, with institutions that tell you what to believe, who to obey, what to fear. The ritual has changed form, but the essence remains. Obed. Ians born from silence, enforced through shame, justified by tradition. And the question you must ask yourself now is this: how many of the rituals in your own life are simply modern masks of the Carver's tradition? How many of the things you call normal are actually chains waiting to tighten? The Carver house is gone. But the system it revealed is everywhere. The Carvers believed they were preserving strength, but what they were really preserving was fear. Fear woven into the bones of their sons, sewn into the silence of their daughters-in-law, rippling through every servant who dared not whisper. Fear that ensured no one, not a single person in that orbit, would challenge the order of things. And this is the lesson the Carvers unknowingly taught America. Fear is the glue that holds power together far more than loyalty ever could. Ask yourself, why do governments lie? Why do institutions hide scandals until exposure becomes impossible? It is not just to protect reputation. It is to maintain the fear that keeps the masses obedient. The Carvers did not need to strike their sons. They did not need to beat their brides. They simply needed to uphold a ritual so heavy, so undeniable, that fear did the work for them. You see, once a man's first act of supposed independence, his wedding night, is stolen, he is no longer a man of his own will. He becomes a man of memory. The memory of humiliation. The memory of knowing he is not sovereign, that even in his most sacred moment, someone else rules. That is the kind of wound that doesn't just scar, it shapes identity. And when identity itself bows, rebellion dies before it can be born. The terrifying truth: you live under the same principle. The rituals are different, but the mechanism is identical. You are humiliated into obedience every time a system demands you play by its rules, no matter how grotesque. You are reminded of your place when your first paycheck is stripped of taxes you never agreed to, when your voice is drowned by institutions larger than you, when your private life is intruded upon by those who claim it is their right. You think you are free, but you were initiated into obedience long before you realized it. The Carvers may be a relic, but their psychology is alive in every corner of modern life. They carved their power into the most sacred bond between man and woman, and today, power is carved into the bond between you and your world. You were born into it, baptized into it, and told it was normal. But normal is just another name for the ritual of the cage. There is a reason the Carver ritual survived for generations, because nobody dared name it for what it was. Secrecy is not maintained by force alone. It is maintained by language, by the words people refuse to say. The Carvers never called it violation. They called it tradition. They never called it humiliation. They called it duty. They never called it theft. They called it heritage. And so, by twisting words, they twisted reality. This is how all control works. Power doesn't only rule your actions, it rules your vocabulary. If you cannot name your chains, you cannot break them. The Carver sons did not say, "My father stole my wife." They said, "My father has the right." And by saying it, they made it true. That is the hidden genius of corruption. It doesn't just dominate your body, it colonizes your mind. Think about the world you live in now. How many lies are disguised as noble words? How many violations are wrapped in patriotic banners, religious verses, or the language of progress? You are told you are protected while you are monitored. You are told you are represented while you are ignored. You are told you are free while invisible hands drain your labor. And because the language is polished, you accept it. You repeat it. Just as the Carver sons did. But let me ask you this. What happens when a man dares to strip the disguise away? When he calls tradition by its real name, control. When he calls obedience by its real name, submission. That man becomes dangerous. Because once truth is spoken clearly, the spell is broken. The leash falls from the mind, and fear begins to weaken. That is why truth has always been the most forbidden thing in history. Not because people cannot handle it, but because once they hear it, they cannot go back to sleep. The Carver's greatest weapon was not the act itself. It was the silence that followed it, the inability of anyone to aim it for what it was. And that silence is what lives on today. Not in their house, not in their rituals, but in yours. Every time you accept the polished words of power without asking what they really mean, you repeat the Carver oath. There's something I haven't told you yet. The Carvers didn't invent their tradition in isolation. They believed they were continuing an inheritance older than America itself. Some claimed it came from Europe, carried across the ocean with blood and scripture. Others whispered it was far older, that it echoed rituals of fertility cults, rites where elders marked the bride as belonging to the clan, not the man. Whatever its origin, the Carvers saw themselves as keepers of a secret law. And that law was simple. The individual is nothing. The bloodline is everything. That is why the groom was broken. That is why the bride was silenced. Because individuals threaten the collective. Love threatens the hierarchy. Freedom threatens the cycle. So the Carvers turned the most intimate human bond into a theater of subjugation. The bride was no longer a woman. She was property. The son was no longer a husband. He was a vessel. Only the patriarch remained sovereign, the living symbol of a power greater than any person. Now look around your world today. Do you see how little has changed? The same principle echoes everywhere. You are told you are free, but only as long as your freedom does not threaten the system. You are told you matter, but only as long as your voice does not rise above the collective. The moment you become inconvenient, you are silenced, redirected, or erased. Just like the Carver brides, just like the Carver sons, this is why forbidden history matters. Because once you understand the Carvers, you begin to see the structure behind your own life. You begin to see how rituals of humiliation and silence are built into your institutions, your economy, even your relationships. And when you see it, truly see it, something inside you begins to shift. You no longer trust the polished lies. You no longer kneel to invisible chains. You begin to wake up, but awakening is dangerous. Because once you see the pattern, you can never return to ignorance. That's why you were never meant to hear this story. That's why it was buried. Because the moment you realize that your life has been shaped by rituals you did not choose, you become ungovernable. The Carver rite was not a family tradition. It was a training ground. Each son learned not through lectures, not through books, but through the most visceral humiliation, that he was never truly free. That is the secret every system of power tries to teach its members. You belong to us first. The Carvers carved it into flesh. Today, institutions carve it into your psyche. Think about the rituals you've passed through. The classroom, where you learned not truth but obedience. The job interview, where you begged to prove your worth to a system that will drain you dry. The military oath, the courtroom pledge, the tax form, rituals dressed in ceremony, demanding you bow before forces greater than yourself. You are told these things are normal, but they are no different from the Carver wedding night. Each is designed to remind you that you are not sovereign, that you are owned. And here is the darkest truth. Most men never question it. They accept the humiliation. They swallow the silence. They repeat the words they are given, just as the Carver sons did. And because they accept, the cycle never breaks. That is why entire nations can be enslaved without chains. That is why entire generations can live and die, never once tasting freedom. But you, right now, are different. Because you are hearing this story. And if it stirs something inside you, if it makes you feel that sharp unease in your chest, that recognition you can't quite name, it means the spell is beginning to crack. It means you are seeing the leash for the first time. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The Carvers may have called it honor. Your society may call it progress. But the effect is the same. Initiation into silence. Humiliation disguised as duty. The theft of your sovereignty before you even realize you had it. You've heard enough now to feel it. The unease. The realization that this is not just history. It's a mirror. That what was done in that house in 1863 is still being done to you, though the rituals have changed their masks. And if that realization is stirring inside you, then you've already stepped onto the path most men will never dare to walk. But I need you to do something, right here, right now. Because this is where the descent deepens. And I don't want you to simply watch this. I want you to seal it. In the comments, I want you to write the words. No more silence. Write it once to break the spell. Write it twice to etch it into your identity. This is not just about algorithms. This is about declaring to yourself that you see through the disguise, that you will not be another Carver son, bowing to rituals he did not choose. Do you understand how powerful this moment is? The Carvers survived because their sons stayed silent, because their brides were forced into silence, because their neighbors lived in silence. Every chain was made of silence. And silence is still the weapon that binds men today. That's why most men live lives of quiet obedience, never daring to speak truth against the systems that own them. But the moment you break silence, the moment you name the truth, you step out of their grip. This is the turning point. History, hidden in dusty rooms, only has meaning if it awakens something in you. If it sharpens your vision, makes you question what you've been told, forces you to see the structures that rule your life. Otherwise, it's just another ghost story. And this is not a ghost story. This is a key. The Carvers were erased from public history because their story exposes how power really works. Not through votes, not through wars, but through humiliation, memory, and silence. Once you understand that, you begin to see the invisible leash around your own neck. And once you see it, you can start to cut it. The Carver story is not just about corruption. It's about the machinery of obedience. Once the bride was broken, once the son was humiliated, the ritual echoed forward into every choice they made. It infected their marriages, their children, their loyalties. That's how rituals work. They're not about the moment. They're about what the moment does to the mind. And this is where most men misunderstand history. They think the past is gone, that what happened in 1863 has no bearing on today. But rituals do not die when the family dies. Rituals seep into the culture. They mutate. They disguise themselves. And soon, Nobody even remembers where they began. They just repeat them, generation after generation, thinking it's normal. That is the curse of silence. It turns crimes into customs. You were raised in the shadow of these customs. You were taught to kneel before invisible fathers, to accept humiliation as how the world works. You've been told since childhood that you are powerless in the face of institutions, that your role is to obey, to perform, to comply. And like the Carver sons, you've been convinced that this is honor, that this is duty, that this is strength. But it is not strength. It is slavery. Here is the real terror. The Carver patriarch never had to raise a hand against his sons once the ritual was in place. He didn't need chains. He didn't need threats. The memory did the work. The ritual itself was enough to make obedience automatic. And isn't that exactly how your world works today? Do you think the system needs to whip you into submission? No. It humiliates you once. Through rejection. Through shame. Through loss. And you carry that memory forever. Obeying the invisible command, the Carvers are not just a story. They are a revelation of how power sustains itself without ever appearing on the surface. And now that you've seen it, you must ask yourself, where, in your own life, have you accepted humiliation as normal? Where have you bowed to rituals you never chose? Where have you lived as a son under the shadow of a patriarch who no longer even needs to exist? This is the descent. Every step deeper strips away illusion. Every step deeper reveals the truth. Power survives not by strength, but by silence. And now you know. Imagine for a moment what it felt like to be a Carver bride. A young woman, often no more than 16 or 17, dressed in lace and hope, promised a new life, a new household. She was told she was marrying into wealth, into stability, into the safety of a powerful family name. Yet behind the veil, another reality waited. On her wedding night, instead of love, she was met with ritual violation. Instead of a husband's embrace, she was taken by a man old enough to be her father or her grandfather. That moment did not just break her body. It rewrote her soul. It taught her that in this family, she had no voice, no protection, no sovereignty. And worse, it taught her husband the same, that he was powerless to defend her, powerless to shield the woman he had sworn to love. 2 lives destroyed in one ritual, and yet the family called it sacred. This is what power does. It teaches victims to carry the wound as if it were honor. Do you see how genius the cruelty was? By violating the bride, the patriarch broke not only her, but also the bond between her and her husband. Their marriage began with betrayal, with shame, with silence. That silence became the foundation of the household. And when silence is the foundation, obedience is the only outcome. The Carvers didn't just control their bloodline. They controlled the psychology of everyone who married into it. No one entered that family without being marked by the ritual. Now ask yourself, how many rituals in your own society function the same way? How many oaths, pledges, or contracts seem noble on the surface, but secretly strip you of your voice, your sovereignty, your power? How many of your bonds, your job, your government, even your faith, are built on silence you were too afraid to question? You think the Carvers were monsters of the past, but look closer. Their ritual is alive every time you accept humiliation as duty, every time you let silence smother truth, every time you convince yourself that obedience is honor. The Carver brides were not just victims, they were mirrors. They show us what happens when men and women alike surrender their voices to the will of an institution. And if you feel anger stirring now, if you feel disgust, good. That means the silence is cracking. The Carvers were not an isolated sickness. They were a symptom, a glimpse into a much larger pattern, one that stretches across history like a shadow. When you strip away the lace and the candlelight, the Carvers' ritual is simply one form of the same design. Initiation through violation. You see it in the feudal rights of lords in medieval Europe. You see it in the hidden rites of secret societies. You see it in the brutal hazing of institutions, military or academic. Always the same principle. To belong, you must first be broken. Think about it. Why would powerful groups demand humiliating rituals from those who want to join? Why would they require men to suffer, to endure, to accept degradation before they can be one of them? Because humiliation is the foundation of obedience. A man who has been broken will never rise against the system that broke him. He will defend it. He will guard it. He will pass it on. That is why these rituals survive for centuries. They do not produce strong men. They produce loyal men. The Carvers dressed their violation as heritage. Today, other systems dress their violations as initiation, as training, as tradition. But the effect is the same. Once you have been forced to accept what should never be accepted, your will is no longer your own. You are bound. You are controlled. And you will pass that control on to the next generation, just as it was passed to you. This is the hidden law of power. Nothing unifies a group more tightly than shared silence, shared wounds, shared humiliation. That's why governments bury scandals but never eliminate them. That's why fraternities haze their recruits. That's why secret orders demand unthinkable vows. Because once you are complicit in silence, you will never break away. Now ask yourself, what initiations have you already endured without even realizing it? What humiliations have you swallowed become? Someone told you it was necessary, honorable, or just how the world works. How many times have you bowed, signed, or sworn without understanding what it was doing to your soul? The Carvers are gone, but their design lives on in every institution that thrives on your silence. And until you name the initiations for what they are, you will remain bound by them, repeating the same cycles, convinced it is all normal. America loves to tell you it was born in freedom. But freedom is only the mask. Beneath it, the same rituals of control have always thrived. The Carvers' right of the first is not so far removed from the hidden initiations that built this country's institutions. Do you think elite families rose to power by virtue alone? Do you think Ivy League halls and political dynasties were forged in honesty? No. They were forged in silence, in humiliations passed down as tradition, in rituals so dark that history books dare not print them. Look closer at the founding of America's secret societies. Skull and Bones, for example, at Yale. Young men destined for politics and banking, crawling through degrading rites to prove their loyalty. The humiliation was never the point. The silence was. Once they carried that silence, they were bound for life. Bound to each other, bound to the group, bound to protect the very system that stripped them of sovereignty. Does that sound so different from the Carvers? Different masks, same design. Even the military has echoes of this law. Hazing rituals, brutal initiations, moments where a man's individuality is crushed so the institution may own him. And though we call it training, though we call it discipline, the essence is the same. Break him first, then he will serve. The Carver patriarchs would have recognized the pattern instantly. The tools have changed. The language has shifted. But the machinery of obedience is identical. And it reaches higher still. Into Congress. Into dynastic families who shape policy. Not for you, but for themselves. Men and women groomed from birth. Raised within private rituals you will never see. Bonds sealed not by votes, not by oaths on a Bible, but by acts so dark that silence becomes their lifelong master. That is why scandals erupt and vanish. That is why corruption festers without consequence. Because those to the top are tied not by laws, but by secrets. So when you think of America's history, do not picture liberty carved in stone. Picture the Carver house, Picture the ritual behind locked doors. Picture the silence that sustains power across generations. Because America, just like the Carvers, was not built on freedom. It was built on obedience dressed as tradition. And once you see that truth, you will never read its history the same way again. The Carvers broke bodies and souls in private chambers. But today, the chamber has no walls. It surrounds you everywhere. The rituals of silence and humiliation have evolved into psychological systems, designed not just for families, but for entire populations. You are living inside the perfected version of what the Carvers began. Think of your schooling. From the first day you sat in a classroom, you were taught the ritual. Sit still, obey the bell, repeat the words, swallow your questions. They told you it was education, but it was initiation. The lesson was not math or history. The lesson was obedience. You learned that your voice was less important than authority, that silence was rewarded, that conformity was survival. And the moment you believed it, the leash slipped around your neck. Then came work. You believed you were entering adulthood, that your labor would make you sovereign. But what did you actually enter? Another ritual. Another Carver wedding night, where you were humiliated by paperwork, stripped by contracts, marked by systems that owned your hours, your energy, your freedom. They didn't need to beat you. They didn't need to chain you. They simply rewrote your identity so that obedience became normal. And here is the brilliance of modern control. It convinces you that your chains are choice, that your debt is freedom, that your silence is professionalism, that your humiliation is opportunity. Just as the Carvers told their sons it was honor, your world tells you it is progress. And most men accept it. They smile through it. They even defend it. Because to question it would mean admitting they have been broken all along. This is why forbidden history matters. Because once you see the Carvers' ritual for what it was, you begin to recognize the same machinery around you now. The humiliation of the groom is the humiliation of the worker. The silence of Ting, he bride, is the silence of the citizen. The cycle is the same. Strip the individual, exalt the system, and call it sacred. The Carvers had a chamber. Today, the chamber is everywhere. In your schools, your offices, your screens, your laws. And unless you learn to name it, to break it, you will die inside it, convinced that your cage is freedom, religion, culture, the very pillars you were told to trust. Do you think they stand apart from this machinery of control? No, they are its finest instruments. The Carvers proved the template. Take what is sacred, corrupt it, and then call the corruption holy. That is how obedience survives. That is how silence is enforced. Look at the Carvers again. They cloaked their violation in scripture. They quoted the Bible to justify the patriarch's right of the first. They called it duty, ordained by God. And because they used sacred words, no one dared challenge them. Do you see the brilliance? Once you wrap corruption in religion, it becomes untouchable. Questioning it doesn't just make you rebellious, it makes you damned. And that fear is stronger than any lock. Now look at your own world. How many rituals of obedience are hidden inside religion and culture? How many voices have been silenced in churches, temples, and mosques because truth threatened the hierarchy? How many women told to obey? How many men told to submit? All in the name of tradition. And if anyone dares question it, what happens? They are exiled, labeled heretic, cast out. The ritual survives because silence is always enforced. Culture plays the same role. You are told what is acceptable, what is normal, what is honorable. But who decides those rules? Who benefits when men police themselves, mocking or exiling anyone who breaks the ritual? That's the genius of culture. It turns the cage into a stage where you willingly play your role. You don't need guards if the prisoners enforce the rules on each other. The Carvers knew this. They didn't have to hide their ritual completely. They only had to frame it as sacred. The same trick is used today. on a scale the Carvers could never have imagined. Entire populations living by unwritten laws, never daring to question, because the cost of breaking silence is exile. The Carvers used a locked room. Today the room is lit with neon. The chamber has become your television, your music, your movies, your feed. Entertainment is no longer just distraction. It is ritual. It is initiation. It is the machinery of control wrapped in light and sound. Think about it. What is a ritual if not repeated images, repeated words, repeated symbols designed to shape belief? That is exactly what media does. Day after day, it floods your senses with the same patterns until you no longer notice them. Violence as entertainment, lust as liberation, authority as wisdom, rebellion as comedy. Every show, every song, every viral clip is another whisper, another thread, pulling you into obedience. And like the Carvers' brides, you mistake the ritual for celebration. Look at the way media humiliates men. Sitcom fathers reduced to bumbling fools. Heroes shown as broken, powerless, mocked for their masculinity. This is not accident. It is initiation. Every time you laugh at the powerless man, you are being trained to accept your own powerlessness. Every time you see obedience framed as virtue, you are being conditioned to wear the leash proudly. Just as the Carver sons bowed in silence, you too are taught to smile as the system breaks you. But it goes deeper. Music. The beat is not neutral. Lyrics repeat mantras of despair, of lust without loyalty, of wealth without meaning. What are these but chants? Incantations shaping a generation into silence. Just as the Carver's patriarch used scripture to cloak his crime, today's elite use culture itself as scripture, teaching you what to love, what to fear, what to worship. And you obey, because the ritual feels like entertainment. Do you see it now? The Carvers had one house. Today, the entire nation is a Carver house. Every screen, every feed, every glowing distraction is another locked room where you are initiated without ever realizing it. You laugh, you sing, you share, never suspecting the silence being sown inside you. It is easy to condemn the Carvers, to point at their ritual and say, monsters. But what about you? What about the men alive today? The truth is far darker. Most men have become the Carvers without even realizing it. Not patriarchs of wealth and land, but agents of silence, carriers of humiliation, enforcers of rituals they don't even understand. Look around. How many men mock each other into obedience? How many use shame as a weapon, not to awaken strength, but to crush individuality? You see it in schools, in locker rooms, in workplaces. A man dares to stand apart, to speak differently, and immediately the ritual begins. Mockery, exclusion, humiliation. It looks like banter, but it is training. It teaches every man in the room the same lesson. Stay silent, conform, or be broken. That is how rituals spread, not from the top down, but through the hands of the broken themselves. This is the hidden genius of power. The Carver patriarch only had to perform the ritual once. After that, his sons carried it into their own marriages, their own children, their own lives. They became the enforcers, and so do you. Every time you tell a man to man up when he is speaking truth, every time you laugh at the dreamer, the misfit, the rebel, every time you tell yourself it's safer to stay silent, you are performing the ritual. You are passing on the chains. That is why this knowledge is dangerous, because once you see it, you realize the enemy is not only out there, it is in you, in your words, your silence, your habits. You have become complicit in your own humiliation, and unless you confront it, unless you break it, you will pass it to the next generation, just as the Carvers did. You've walked through the Carver chamber. You've seen the machinery of humiliation, silence, and control, how it echoes through history, through institutions, through culture, and even through your own choices. Now comes the turning point. Because this descent is not just about knowledge, It is about initiation of a different kind. The Carvers bound their sons with silence. I will bind you with truth. They broke men by humiliating them. I will awaken you by commanding you to stand. They told their family that obedience was honor. I tell you that obedience is death. If you've come this far, you are no longer the same man you were at the start. You feel it in your chest, the stirring, the unease, the hunger. That is the beginning of power, but only if you seal it. Here is how you seal it. Step into the chamber willingly. Break the silence publicly. Prove to yourself that you will not be like the Carver sons, broken, humiliated, obedient. Prove that you will speak when silence is demanded. Right now, in this moment, I am asking you to write in the comments the phrase that marks the fracture. The silence ends with me. Write it once, and you will feel the resistance. Write it twice, and you will feel the shift. This is no algorithm trick. It is initiation. The act itself is the ritual but inverted. Where the Carvers demanded obedience, you declare rebellion. Where they demanded silence, you proclaim defiance. Where they bound men in humiliation, you rise in power. Do not underestimate this. Most will not do it. Most will hear these words and retreat into comfort, just as the Carver sons retreated into silence. But a few, the ones willing to face themselves, the ones willing to carry power instead of chains, will write it. And when they do, they will know they have crossed a threshold, not because of me, not because of this video, but because of themselves. This is the initiatio. No one wanted you to find. Not humiliation, not obedience, not silence, but choice. And once chosen, it cannot be undone. So ask yourself now, will you walk away unchanged? Or will you declare it? Will you seal it? The silence ends with me. Twice. Out loud. Visible to the world. That is the mark of the awakened. Not every man will write the phrase. Not every man will break the silence. And those who refuse will pay the price, not in chains of iron, but in chains of the soul. The man who clings to silence becomes a prison, not only for himself, but for everyone he touches. Think of the Carver sons who never defied their father. They grew old, but they never grew free. They raised children, but they never raised them strong. They carried the ritual like a parasite inside them, infecting every decision, every relationship, every bond. Their silence became inheritance. Their obedience became destiny. That is the cost of refusal. You don't escape the ritual. You become the ritual. Look at your own world. How many men walk around broken but smiling, humiliated but pretending, enslaved but boasting of freedom? They never question the traditions that crushed them. They never confront the rituals that rewrote their souls. They think compliance is survival. But the truth is darker. Compliance is contagion. The obedient man becomes a transmitter of chains. He humiliates others as he was humiliated. He silences others as he was silenced. He enforces rules he never even chose. And here is the most brutal truth. The man who refuses to break silence is more dangerous than the master himself. Why? Because he carries the master inside him. He becomes a walking chamber, a living Carver house. Every joke he tells, every order he enforces, every silence he demands from others, he is spreading the ritual. He is doing the master's work without ever realizing it. Do you understand now why breaking silence matters? Because if you don't, you're not neutral, you're not safe, you're not outside the system. You are part of it. And that is the darkest fate of all. To live as a prison cell for others, to die never having broken free. The Carvers are gone, but their shadow remains in every man who chooses silence over defiance. The question is not whether you will face the ritual. The question is whether you will break it, or whether you will pass it on. And that choice, whether you face it or flee from it, will echo through every life you touch. A broken man creates a broken house. A broken house creates a broken generation. And when enough generations live in silence, they create a broken nation. This is the unspoken history of America. Not the victories written in textbooks, but the fractures buried beneath them. A country that calls itself free, while millions of its men live as Carver sons. Silent, obedient, complicit, the Carvers' ritual never stayed locked in their chambers. It rippled outward, like all rituals do. First into their town, where neighbors whispered but never acted. Then into their region, where silence became culture. And in time, into the very bloodstream of a nation, where humiliation as initiation became the norm. This is how civilizations are shaped, not by ideals, but by unspoken wounds. Look at America's cycles. Every time truth threatens power, silence follows. Scandals vanish. Voices are crushed. Whistleblowers are mocked, exiled, destroyed. And the crowd cheers, never realizing they are cheering for their own chains. That is the Carver ritual on a grand scale. Not one bride, not one groom, but an entire people, humiliated, silenced, and taught to call it honor. Do you wonder why corruption never dies? Why wars repeat? Why systems exploit generation after generation? It is because silence has become cultural DNA. Just as the Carver sons bowed their heads, entire populations bow their heads to institutions. They obey out of habit, out of fear, out of the illusion that obedience is survival. But survival at that price is not life. It is servitude. And here lies the secret no school will teach you. Civilizations fall not because of their enemies, but because of their silence. Rome did not burn because of barbarians. It rotted from within. Silent senators, obedient citizens, broken men who accepted humiliation as normal. America is not immune. It has followed the same path. And if you listen closely, you can already hear the fracture. The Carvers were a family. America is a family of millions. But the ritual is the same. And unless men break it, unless they shatter silence with truth, the fate is written. A nation of Carver sons pretending to be free while living as slaves. The Carvers feared one thing above all. A son who would not stay silent. A bride who would not accept shame. A single voice that refused the ritual. Why? Because silence was the glue that held their power together. Break that, and the entire house collapsed. This truth scales. It is not only families who live by silence. It is nations. It is empires. It is the world itself. Think about it. Every institution you were told to trust, government, religion, media, finance, what do they fear most? Not war, not collapse, not even death. They fear exposure. They fear one voice refusing silence. Because once truth is spoken, silence loses its spell. The ritual breaks. And with it, the machinery of control begins to unravel. That is why whistleblowers are hunted. That is why dissidents are erased. That is why men who speak out are mocked, canceled, or destroyed. It is not because their words are foolish. It is because their words threaten the ritual. Power survives by silence. Break silence, and you threaten power itself. That is why the Carver sons bowed their heads. That is why your leaders demand your obedience. That is why silence is called honor, loyalty, patriotism. Not because it is noble, but because it is necessary for their survival. Now see the inversion. The Carvers taught their sons that breaking silence would mean exile, shame, death. But the truth is opposite. Breaking silence is life. Breaking silence is the one act that terrifies the master. One voice refusing to bow has more power than 1,000 men kneeling. That is why this dissent matters. Because once you see the machinery, you hold the weapon that can destroy it. But make no mistake, this knowledge is dangerous. Once you carry it, you cannot return to comfort. You will see the rituals everywhere. In families, in laws, in culture, in your own reflection. And if you dare to break them, the system will notice. The Carvers would have crushed a rebellious son. Modern institutions will try to crush you, but that fear only proves the truth. Silence is their lifeline. Your voice is the blade at their throat. And so the choice comes clear. Stay silent, and you preserve their world. Speak truth, and you threaten it. One path is obedience, the other is war. And every man must decide which master he serves. The Carvers are dust. Their house is gone. Their names barely remembered. But their shadow survives, because the ritual they practiced was never about them. It was about power itself, to humiliate, to silence, to command obedience without chains. That design did not die in 1863. It became the hidden architecture of the world you live in now. Look around. Governments demanding loyalty, corporations demanding silence, churches demanding obedience, media demanding your attention. Everywhere you turn, the Carver chamber waits, disguised as tradition, culture, progress, faith. And every time you bow, every time you laugh when you should rage, every time you swallow truth to stay safe, you are standing in that chamber. You are reliving that night. But here is the forbidden truth. You are not a Carver son. You are not bound to their ritual. You do not have to carry their silence another step. The very fact that you have followed me this far proves it. You have felt the unease, the recognition, the stirring in your chest. That is the signal. That is the crack in the wall. That is the first sign of awakening. And now the choice stands before you naked. Most men will retreat. They will turn off this voice, return to comfort, and bury themselves again in the rituals. They will laugh it off, call it nonsense, pretend the silence is strength. They will live as slaves while calling themselves free. That is their fate. But a few, very few, will take this knowledge and burn it into their identity. They will refuse humiliation. They will refuse silence. They will walk into the Carver chamber and shatter it with defiance. And when they do, they will no longer be men shaped by the world. They will be men shaping the world itself. So the question is not whether the Carver ritual still exists. It does. The question is whether you will remain inside it, or whether you will end it. Whether you will live as a silent son, or rise as a man who cannot be bound. That is the razor's edge. That is the final descent. And now you must decide.